So we left off yesterday after talking about Avram's journey and Sarah's abduction. Remember that? Okay. So the result of that, we said last time, was Avram came into money, and we spoke about Lot and how money corrupted him and how he left Avraham. Okay, still sound familiar?
Yes.
Okay, good. So now, what happened to Lot? So I'm going to give you more information about Lot's fate and deeper information about what was happening. Okay, so Lot's fate, he ended up going to Sodom. How did you think he justified that to himself? It was a terribly corrupt place. How could you leave Avraham and go to Sodom and live with yourself? So he convinced himself that he would change the place. He would be, so to speak, the Sodom Rebbe. Okay, so if you were Avraham, would that be a reasonable thing to conceive of? That you can go someplace that's utterly corrupt and change it? Absolutely. So how could he possibly know that he couldn't do this? How could he know that he can't do this? So I want to tell you how. When you try to influence somebody else by exposing yourself to what they think and what they feel, you have to be sure that your relationship to them is you're the giver and not the recipient. If you're the recipient, you're going to also be influenced. So Lot, if he was honest with himself, which he wasn't, would have recognized that he's really going there for other reasons. Okay, so taking this further, at this point, after Lot leaves Avraham, Avraham is promised the land a second time. So we have at the beginning of the Parsha, he's promised the land. He's going to be promised the land here, and 2 more times in the Parsha. So what is the fact that Lot was not honest with himself about his motivations to go to live in Sodom have to do with Avram's being promised the land? So this takes us back to Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael is the place of revelation. As long as Lot was with him, Hashem was not going to reiterate this promise, because Lot, at this point, wouldn't know what to do with Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael is the place of seeking Hashem, and at this point, Lot wasn't. Having said this, okay, the time will come. Remember how Avram said to Lot, not you go your way, I'll go my way, but if you go to the left, I'll be at your right. If you go to the right, I'll be at your left, meaning he's committed to him. So Lot's descendants are going to come back to Eretz Yisrael. How so? Okay, so you know the story of Ruth? Yeah. So what was Ruth's relationship to Lot? Okay, she was a great-granddaughter. In other words, Lot ended up, as we'll learn next week, ended up in the cave. There's incest. His daughters have relations with him. They bear children. One is called Moab. Ruth is a Moabite. Ruth comes back to this heritage. Who's the descendant of Ruth? Do you know? David. So when Avraham said, if you go to the left, I'll be at your right, it's because he knew that there would always be closeness. But not until there's inner change, not until Lot's descendants change deeply. Mashiach is a descendant of David. So what that's supposed to tell you is that Mashiach, who's the source of redemption, the one who will bring everybody back in Tshuva, okay, he has to be coming from a place where decisions were made. We saw here's where a person could fall and here's how to come back. He has to be coming from that spring. Okay, in the meantime, and this is where we left off, there's a war. Remember this? We got up to the war? The war. Okay, 4 kings against 5. This is coming back to you. Okay, so you might recall yesterday we said everything that happens in the lives of the patriarchs reverberate in the future of the Jewish people. Avraham went to Mitzrayim when he shouldn't have gone. The Jews had to be in Mitzrayim. These 4 kings and Avram's battle against them, and they're eventually saying, you prevail, you're the Prince of God, parallel the 4 exiles. So I want to take you through the 4 exiles and how we'll ultimately defeat them and what they're there for. So the first exile, and exile is not just geographic, it means moving away from who you are. The Jews were in Israel, they sinned, as the Torah predicted, and they were carted off to Babylon. What was Babylon like? What was that exile like? So Babylon was the first power to really do major conquests. So I want to tell you something about human nature. People like a winner. Is that true? Okay, so the Jews found themselves enamored with everything Babylonian because they were the winners, bigadol. So how did they come back to themselves? We didn't assimilate to Babylon. We saw how morally corrupt they were. That made us feel a certain revulsion, and that brought us back to ourselves. So the idea of Golus is that you learn who you are through learning who you aren't and who you don't want to be. So the Jews, by and large, after the years of the Babylonian exile, they were still in Babylon. Babylon fell, but the Jews are still there. Babylon was conquered by Persia. So the Jews didn't go anywhere. They're in the same place, Babylon, but now it's not called Babylon anymore. Now it's called Persia. The Persian Empire was very different than the Babylonian Empire. Are any of you Persian? No. Do you know Persians in America? Yeah. How would you describe their homes? Okay. Over the top? Okay. Just like Achashverosh's palace. That's why it's described. Nothing changed in Persian culture. So Persian culture isn't like Babylonian culture. Babylonian culture is militant. Persian culture is luxury-oriented. The Persians defeated the Babylonians, and the Jews went for everything Persian. It's very appealing. What made them see that there's more to it than that? The whole Purim story. When they saw that you could have people with sophisticated, luxury-loving, live in beauty, but they have no morality. Okay? So the way the Persian story ends for us is with Esther bearing children with Achashverosh. One of her children, all of her children, of course, were Jewish, right? But they didn't identify themselves as Jews. One of her sons, whose name was Darius the Mede in English, okay, was Jewish, but he didn't think of himself as Jewish, but he gave the Jews permission to go back to Israel. Do you think all of the Jews who've been living in Babylon forever, as far as they're concerned, and in great luxury in Persia, are going to say, great, let's move? No, they didn't. The majority of them stayed put, at least at the beginning. But that led to slowly Jews coming back to Israel and building the second temple. But this was because the Persians allowed them. So at the beginning of the second temple period, Israel was really a colony of Persia. So even though they weren't officially called a colony, they were dependent on Persia materially and militarily. Just like Israel today is dependent on America materially and militarily, in case you didn't know this, okay? So the Greeks conquered Persia. So that meant that the Jews are now under the authority of the Greeks. The Greeks were very different than the Persians. The Greeks brought the human-centered world into being. Until then, the world for everybody was God-centered. The Greeks created a world in which everything is human-centered. They created humanism. So the Jews fell for that in a big way because it had a strong intellectual base. And then you have the Hanukkah story. So the Jews prevail, and the menorah is lit in the Mikdash, and the forces of light defeat the forces of darkness. How long did that last? Several generations, and that's it. The Romans conquered the Greeks. Okay? The Romans have three major philosophies, which they drew from the empires that preceded them. The Romans brought democracy into the world, so their philosophies came from earlier sources. Okay, so one philosophy is hedonism. What does hedonism mean? Just enjoy life. Just enjoy life. Don't think too much. Just enjoy. Do people think like this today? They do. Okay. Another philosophy. Another philosophy is academia, which means thinking that knowledge is power and has meaning intrinsically. Are there people who think that about knowledge? They do. Last philosophy is Spartan philosophy, which is if you try hard and you struggle and you reach your goal, you're a superior person. It doesn't matter what your goal is. Do people think like this today? Yeah. Okay. So we're still in the Roman exile. But the end of the story here is that the kings captured Lot, Avraham rescues Lot, and they elect him as king, meaning eventually when Mashiach comes, this will be recognized that the spiritual core of the world is from us. Okay. Okay, so after this war, the kings who he helped wanted to give him honors. They wanted to present him with riches, with spoils of war. Be Avraham. Okay? Do you think he took it or he didn't take it? He deserved it. He refused to take it, and I want to tell you why. He said, I don't want anyone to ever say that you made me rich. My riches came directly through the miracle that God did for Paro. Okay, do the nations of the world say that the riches of the Jews were stolen from them? Is that how the anti-Semites put it? Okay, the Jews have the economy. We work and they gain. Okay, so you learned something from here. All of the commentators speak about this. Don't live ostentatiously when you're living amongst non-Jews. Don't do that. Do Jews have a bad habit of living ostentatiously? Show-offingly. Okay? Okay, give me an example of what that would look like. Okay, Florida, LA. Okay. Don't make a bar mitzvah with your son that have helicopters and cloud machines. Like, don't do this, okay? Okay, so, because they invariably are going to see everything we have as coming from them. Okay, so then after this, Hashem comes to Avraham in a vision. He tells him, don't be afraid, your reward is very great. What do you think Avraham was afraid of? Or more correctly, what did Hashem think Avraham was afraid of? So he thought he got all of his reward in this world. So was he right or wrong? Wrong. So I want to explain to you why. There is no real reward for mitzvot in this world because it doesn't work. In other words, suppose you have somebody who you admire. Give me an example of somebody who's morally admirable. Okay. And now for real. Okay, no?
Emma Watson.
Who?
Emma Watson.
Okay, good. So suppose nobody heard of her. What would you say so admirable about her?
She stands up for women's rights. She's very involved in education and widening access to literature.
Okay, right, you heard that? So suppose it was the end of her life, and somebody says, you know, you did so much, and they repeated, women's rights, education, literature, I'm going to give you $5,000. That's your reward. Does that work?
No. Yeah.
It doesn't, and I want to tell you why. It doesn't match. You can't give material reward for spiritual efforts. It doesn't work. Okay, clear? So, true reward comes in the future life. Goodies here make your stay here sweeter, and they also give you the means to do things. Otherwise, you're stuck. Okay, clear? Okay, but people who are evil get all of their reward here because why? It's the same thing. They can't relate to spiritual reward. So, did I tell you about my aunt's neighbor? My aunt lived in a two-family house in Bensonhurst, which is a neighborhood in Brooklyn. Her neighbors were members of a certain family. In fact, they always referred to themselves as being members of the family. They would say, he's a member of the family. Yeah. Okay, got this? Those were her neighbors. So, and this, we all knew about this. It was all like very out in the open. So one day I was a child, I was watching TV, and I saw on the news, this was filmed live because they expected a different outcome. Okay, the mafia was having a big sort of congress in a fish restaurant in Brooklyn, and the FBI came in. Now they came in like with guns. You see this on like in the news thing, policemen with guns. So okay, put up your hands. Now they thought what would happen next was everybody would go like that and leave. It's not what happened. They began shooting down the cops, who then what? They mowed them away. It took like seconds, okay? So there was this big bloodbath that I saw on TV as a child, okay? But
It's like a fake
No, I related to it like it was a fake show, but it wasn't fake. It was real.
Yeah.
But like I'd seen lots of horror movies and crime movies, so I didn't take it so seriously. I was like sort of callous. So I called up my aunt as this is happening, say, "Hey, Aunt Seal, turn on NBC News." So she says, "Why?" I said, "Because they just killed like your neighbor downstairs." You know, Mr. Banana. They just like, that really was his name, but Joe Banano. Okay, they just like killed him on TV. So she turns on the news and she sees this is for real, and she began yelling at me, "How could you talk about this in this tone? This is a tragedy. Don't you understand?" You know, and I'm like, okay. But because I was like a child and like very callous, I said, "But like he's with the mafia. That's why they killed him. You know, like don't you know what that means? Like that means like they kill people and steal and like do all of this bad stuff." Now she's crying hysterically by now. So she's, "You don't understand. He was the best neighbor. He always helped me with my packages. He kept the garden so nice, and he was such a good son. His mother would come, and he treated her with the most respect," and like, you know, on and on and on. Okay, so the reason I'm telling you this story is that for somebody like Joe Bonanno, there's no olam haba. Like a person who could kill people randomly can't relate to spiritual reward. So whatever reward he deserved, he got here in this world. Okay, clear? So the basic idea is you get what you really want. Okay, clear? Okay, so going back to Avram. So Avram's afraid that he won't be rewarded in the future life. Why? He knew, like he wasn't stupid. So the idea is as follows. I want you to get this. He was saved by miracles how many times so far? From what you know of his narrative. The fiery furnace, and now in this war. So he felt that he may not deserve.
What about in Egypt?
What? And in Egypt, right? You're right, war. Okay. So he was saved by miracle many times. So at this point he's thinking, did I live up to being the kind of person God expects a person who survives a miracle to be? That was his doubt. You understand this? So if you survive a miracle, you're expected to live with it and not forget it. And it's supposed to change you. And he wasn't sure he lived up to it. Okay, and there was something else. In a war, you kill people. Is that true or not?
True.
That's why it's called what? War, okay. So like whatever. So Avram killed people and he wasn't sure, even though he did it to rescue Lot, which was a valid purpose, he wasn't sure where that would put him. So he was afraid. So God said, "Don't be afraid, your reward is very great." Then Avram said something very daring. Did any of you know what he said next? He said, "What difference does it do, whatever you give me, what difference does it make at this point? When I die, everything I have will go to my servant Eliezer. I have no child." So does that, if God told you you had great reward, what would you say?
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, not, well, what? You know, that sounds like a kid from LA. You know what I mean? I'm buying an electric train set. Well, like, what good is for? Like, I have this like funny little small bedroom. Like, I have really to display. I need like a big thing. Okay. So what he's saying is that he sees himself as having a mission, and he realizes he's not young. And he said, no matter how much spiritual enlightenment you give me, where is it going to go in just a few years? So at that point, Hashem told him, Eliezer's not going to inherit you. Your own child will inherit you. Okay, and then he said more. Still another promise of the land. Why? Because this promise is for the land the same way it excluded who? Who was excluded? Lot. It also was going to exclude Eliezer. So what that means is the Jewish people specifically are the only people who know what to do with Eretz Yisrael. So what do you do with Eretz Yisrael? What's it about? It's about finding Hashem in the physical world. So, in fact, like many mitzvahs of the Torah can only be observed in Eretz Yisrael when there's a temple. Okay, clear? So at that point, they made a covenant. So the covenant required that Avraham take animals, the kind of animals that are used normally in sacrifice, and divide them in two. And then a flame went between the two halves. And then Hashem revealed to him everything that would happen in the future. So I'm first going to tell you what Hashem revealed, and then we'll talk about why it had to take place, this revelation, in this way. He said, you should know with certainty. Now Hashem just told him he would have children. Your children are going to be enslaved and suffer in a land that's not theirs. And they're going to be there for 400 years. They're going to suffer for 400 years. And then I'll judge the nation that oppressed them. And after 4 generations, I'll bring them back here. Okay? And again, the son said, and Hashem told him, still another time, I'm giving this land to your descendants. So at this point, when Hashem told him about what would be the first exile, okay, Avraham was shown in a spiritual vision all of the exiles. So that means Hashem opened the gates of time. He showed Avraham the destruction of the 2 temples. He saw the Inquisition. He saw the Holocaust. He saw everything. Hashem said, this is what's going to happen to your descendants. Or he gave them a possible alternative. Or instead of being challenged in this world, they'll get punished in the next world for whatever they sin. They'll get Gehenna. To which Hashem said, no. Avraham said, no. When they need to be straightened out, when they need to suffer, let it be here. And this was after he saw the whole picture. So of all of the things that he saw, the one that came closest to breaking him was one of the great sages of the Talmud, had a daughter. And he saw her being sold as a slave, as a sex slave in the Roman market. That almost broke him, but it didn't. So the question is, why not? So the answer there is that Avraham, more than anyone, certainly more than we, appreciated that anything that God does is to bring us to an ultimate place of good. So the suffering and the challenges and the suffering relate to us the way a smelting iron relates to silver. Did you ever see how precious metals come out of the ground? Did you ever see this? So if you were to see this, your teacher should have showed you this in 4th grade. This is part of the normal educationals. Okay, whatever. So, goodness. Okay, so they take out, let's say, I'll give you silver as an example because that's the one in the Midrash. A big stone like this, it looks like any stone, but you could see a bright gray line. Then what happens? How do you get at the silver? You have to expose the stone to so much heat that everything that's part of the rock flies off the metal. Then you're left with the metal, but the metal still has impurities, and it has to be brought to a higher heat still. So that process is called smelting, and this is how all precious metals are mined. So we're compared to precious metals, meaning it's when you let go of all of the outside that you know your own inside. So from Hashem's perspective, if we can come to some level of enlightenment without suffering, that's much better. But historically, we tend to not go there. So I want to just give you an example of this. I don't know if you realize this, because people don't often appreciate this. Do you realize that the times we live now are the most prosperous times that the human race has ever experienced? Do you realize this? Like, nothing is even a good number 2. So in this room, how many of you have ever been on a diet or thought about dieting? Okay. Do you think your great-grandparents ever thought about dieting? No. Okay. How many of you sometimes have issues in your home, like, where should I put all my stuff? It's so hard to keep organized. You have those kind of issues? What? The storage issues. Your great-grandparents did not have storage issues. Okay, so the plenitude we have now is beyond belief. People feel financially stressed because everybody's expectations keeps on rising. But even the possibility of having stuff like we have now is out of sight. when during the Depression, the president of the time was Hoover in America. So he wanted to give people like a fantasy of prosperity. So what did he hold out? He said, and when you vote for me, one day you'll have, what do you think he's, a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. In America, do most families have only one car? No. They would feel deprived if they only had one car. Angry, depressed. Okay, clear? Do people dream of having chicken? No. Okay, clear? It's just like regular food. So this enormous prosperity that we have, has it led people to becoming more moral, more spiritually oriented, more sacred? Absolutely not. So the same way we've never been where we are materially, arguably since the more depraved era of the Roman Empire, we have never reached a point of moral depravity that begins to echo what we have now. So give me like 2 examples of moral depravity, just 2. Okay, I'm going to give you one. I just read this in the news. I don't know if you'll agree with me and see this is morally depraved. Okay, there are 2 gay men, okay? They're living together as, I don't know what you would call them, man and man, but they don't see it that way because one of them identifies as a woman. So he had surgeries done and all sorts of like stuff done to his body chemically. So he looks like a woman, but he's a man. Okay, so they bring a 3rd person into their picture. They want a child. So he can't bear a child, even though he looks more feminine than we do, but he can't bear a child. So who do they find? They find a woman who's had surgery done and chemicals taken to make her seem like what? A man. So they have this picture in the paper, the 3 of them. She just gave birth, okay, clear? She has hair on her face. She looks like a man, okay? And then there's this man who looks like a woman standing next to her, and this other man who looks like a man. Is this depraved or not?
No.
You don't see this as depraved. So I see our standards have come to a point where we don't see it as depraved anymore. I realize as I chose this, you won't see this as depraved because everybody is a consenting adult, right? Okay. From the Torah's perspective, one of the most basic things is accepting that you use what God gave you. Okay? So the child, okay, every child is meant to have 2 parents who bring different things to their upbringing. So if you have 2 people of the same sex bearing a child, the child who wasn't consulted is going to either not have a father or not have a mother who has the traits of a woman or a man, not just the physical biology. So from a Judaic perspective, this is extremely selfish from all people's perspective. Does that make sense to you at all? Do you see it as selfish? You don't see it as selfish. We're allowed to disagree. Okay. Okay, yeah?
What about in the circumstance of like a child with no parents at all?
So if you have, like there are tragedies that occur. So if a child has no parents, let's say the parents are killed in a car accident. So people should adopt the child. But ideally, for the child's psychological needs, the child should have a father figure and a mother figure. But the mother figure should be female and the father figure male. I want to give you a stat. You could relate to this better because it's statistically viable. Okay, in Wisconsin, they did this experiment. There are some places where there are a great many single-parent families. So when you say single parent, who's the single parent? The mom. Okay, so the stats about their children are very, very bad, especially the boys, by any measure. Economic progress, jail sentencing, violent crimes, drug addiction, it's very bad. So there are all sorts of theories about this. Okay, in the liberal world, of course, this will all be attributed to economic deprivation. But somebody started a school that has male teachers, and they segregated the boys from the girls. What do you think the results were on the boys? Much better in every measurable respect. Far less crime, far less drug addiction, far better academic progress. And they attribute this to the fact that they have male role models. Okay, does that make any sense to you? This is statistically viable, but it's so politically incorrect that they're not opening more schools. They're sending boys to the schools where they'll be defeated in life, be drug addicted, and end up in prison, rather than sending them to the politically incorrect schools where they have male role models. Welcome to the States. Okay, clear? Tough. So I should have chosen another example of moral depravity. I realized this is a stupid one on my side to choose. But the murder statistics, the theft statistics, the business that happened with mortgages not that long ago. Do you know what I'm talking about? Okay, so all of this is not coming from desperation and poverty. It's coming from greed and selfishness. So because of this, we tend to do better in situations where we have to strive rather than when we have a lot, which is why God promised Avraham all of this stuff. Okay, so we're mid-Parsha. More tomorrow. And if I offended you, I apologize.